So welcome back. This is part 3 in this series on the Raspberry Pi. And if you're interested in how to hook up a Raspberry Pi and connect it to an external hard drive and configure it and everything, I encourage you to look at part 1 in this series where I go through in great detail how to connect it. In this video, we're going to talk about connecting the Raspberry Pi and configuring it with a Labjack. Now, what is a Labjack? A Labjack is a professional industry-grade data acquisition device. And it's kind of an extension of what you get with the Raspberry Pi in terms of the GPIO, or general purpose input-output pins, which I'm highlighting here on the Raspberry Pi. But it greatly extends on that, and it brings it more into an industrial-grade functionality. Why would you want to use a Raspberry Pi with a Labjack? Well, if you've ever looked at the GPIO, or general purpose input-output pins on a Raspberry Pi, they're very limited. You can only apply 3 volts maximum. And in fact, if you get much above 3 volts, I think you can cause some damage to your components. And those pins are digital only. There's no analog input or output, no analog to digital conversion. It's just for small level digital signals. Now you can get add-ons, but as the Raspberry Pi comes, there is no analog or input or output. And like I said, Labjack is a professional industry-grade data acquisition device, which, if you need it, is really a nice way to extend the Raspberry Pi. So why wouldn't you want a Raspberry Pi and a Labjack? Well, honestly, the Raspberry Pi is Linux-based, and Labjack data acquisition device is much better with Windows. There's a lot of software available for it. It's a lot easier to configure and to use if you need that. If you need basic functionality, it's fine with the Raspberry Pi. Now, another reason that you might want to do the Raspberry Pi and the Labjack is you can get hats, which are hardware attached on top, basically plug-in cards for the Raspberry Pi that will give you limited analog functionality. Again, it's limited functionality, but if that's what you need, then it's fine. And the other downside is the Labjack cost is at least $100. I think that the entry-level Labjack is something like $115 at this point, so it is rather expensive compared to the $40 Raspberry Pi. But if you've decided that you want to use a Labjack with a Raspberry Pi, the installation and configuration is fairly straightforward, but again, it's Linux, so you're going to have to do some command line stuff. So the first thing you're going to have to do is go to your Raspberry Pi and fire up your browser, which is the Chrome browser on Raspberry Pi. And you're going to have to go to the Labjack website and install some drivers and software. So here's my Raspberry Pi window. I'm running it on a VNC viewer inside Windows 10. And you're going to have to go to your browser, Internet, Chrome web browser, and you're going to have to navigate to the labjack.com/support/software/installers website. And the first thing you're going to have to do is install the low-level Linux driver called the EXO driver. And it's fairly straightforward. You just go to the link and download. But the next thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to build that installation of the EXO driver, and that's going to require you do some manual command line steps. If you're familiar with Linux, you're going to have to do some sudo stuff, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But you're going to have to follow the build instructions at the same web address under Mac and Linux in-depth build instructions. And we'll go through them in the next slide here. So once you've done that build, you also have to install a higher level Linux driver called the LJAC LM, which is really nice because it gives you some examples on how to connect to the Labjack. And that's at the labjack.com supports software installers. And then you go to the device. I've got a U12, which is kind of outdated. I believe the U3 is the new version of that. But you find the location and you need to install the LJAC LM for whatever device you have. So here's for the first driver, the build instructions that you're going to have to type out in your command line. So you're going to go to your Raspberry Pi, you're going to go to the terminal, and you're going to have to type out these commands. Now again, that's listed here in the build instructions, and it also includes if you also want to install some Python. I didn't include that here, but if you want, you can pause this and just copy down those instructions and type them in, and that will install your EXO driver. So at this point, you've downloaded the EXO driver, you've installed it, you've installed the Labjack LM, and that will put on your desktop a folder called Labjack LM. Your Raspberry Pi should look like this, your desktop, and you will have here, you can see this Labjack LM that has been installed, and if you click on that, you can see it's got some Labjack LM install, README, and some examples. You can look at the examples, so it's got some nice stuff in here to show you examples of how to connect. The next thing you need to do is connect the Labjack to the USB of the Raspberry Pi. So you can see here, what I've got is my Labjack, and I've got a USB cable connected to a USB input on the Raspberry Pi. And here I've got a smartphone battery that's powering the Raspberry Pi, and I talk about that in my part 2 video from the Raspberry Pi. And I've also included a USB ammeter, which measures how many amps are flowing from the battery to the Raspberry Pi. And you can see with the Labjack hooked up, it really doesn't take much current. The normal Raspberry Pi takes about 0.3 amps, and this is just a tad over 0.3. So once you plug this into the USB of the Raspberry Pi, the status LED, this LED down here, should immediately blink 4 times and then stay off while the computer enumerates or installs the U12. Okay, so it starts out 4 blinks. When it's done, it will blink twice and remain on solidly, and then you know you're good to go. So the next thing, I recommend you go into your Raspberry Pi terminal window and just investigate what you just downloaded and maybe run a couple examples so you can see what you've got. So what I would do is, here's something you can copy down or follow, but we'll go through it. The first thing, here's my terminal window and I'm at Raspberry Pi. The first thing I usually do is go DIR to see where I am, and I'm above the desktop downloads, Magpie, pictures, and so on. But I want to go to the desktop to get to this Labjack LM. So I go CD, desktop, and you can see, remember you have to have capitals on the D. And then I do a DIR to see what's in there, and there's our Labjack LM. So I can go CD to Labjack LM, and then DIR, and you can see I've got the examples, install Labjack LM, and README. So then I can go to CD, EXAMPLES, and I do a DIR, and I've got those files we saw already under the examples. So then what I can do is I can run one of these, and I'm going to choose to run the list all, and that will basically list all of the connected Labjack devices so you can verify that it's connected and you can recognize it. To do that, I do a /list-all, and you can see it said list all found one U12 device, and here's the device information. So I know it recognizes it, and it's working fine. So then what I can do is I can do /analog, and it will tell me what driver version is, and it will setting the analog output to 0.8 volts and analog output 1 to 3.2, and inputs it says are 1.43. So you can see it's working. So you can be fairly confident that you can access it. So once you've got that, you know that everything's working and configured. The next thing, and probably the final thing I'll discuss, is you got to figure out how you're going to connect to this and get and send data. And for the Labjack, you're pretty much limited to either C code or Python. Now, as you can see, there are some examples. In the examples, let's take a look. In the examples, you've got some .c files. So you've got analog.c, digital.io.c, easy functions, listall.c. So they're basically giving you some examples that you can use to figure out how to, in C, access the Labjack. And here's just one of them. In the examples folder, I've taken the C file of the easy functions, which are functions that are already made that you can use to access. And this, if you click on that C file, you'll start this Genie environment that is built in. So let me do that. I'll go to easyfunctions.c, double click, and you can see this Genie software comes up, and you can scroll through here and you can see how there's got some good documentation. It tells you what each component is, and you can just copy and paste any of these functions that you need into your own C code to access the Labjack via the Raspberry Pi. So that's about it. I hope this helps you, and take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.